In the corporate world of glass and steel, silence isn't always golden. Sometimes, it is the sound of a spirit being compressed, waiting for the precise moment to detonate. And for Alara Vance, silence had become her sharpest weapon, forged in the fires of observation, and honed on the whetstone of quiet indignation. Her moment was coming, but first she had to endure the sound of her own heart breaking. The scene was the main conference room at Innovate Dynamics, a place that smelled of stale coffee and expensive ambition. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off the polished mahogany table, but it couldn't touch the cold shadows gathering in the corners of the room, or the one forming inside Alara's chest. All eyes were on Liam Carter, the company's golden boy, as he stood before the board. He was charismatic, his voice smooth and confident as he clicked through the slides of a presentation titled Project Chimera, a revolutionary data analytics algorithm that promised to pull the aging firm back from the brink of irrelevance. The executives were captivated, leaning forward, their faces a mixture of awe and relief. They saw a savior. Alara saw a thief. Seated in a forgotten chair against the wall, she was functionally invisible, a ghost in the machine of her own making. She didn't hear the enthusiastic murmurs or the soft tapping of a pen against a notepad. She heard only the echo of her own voice, late at night, explaining the complex architecture of Chimera to Liam, her trusted friend, the one she considered her work brother. Every bullet point on his slides was a memory. Every elegant line of code he claimed as his own was a piece of her soul. This wasn't just his project, it was her entire world for the past 6 months, built during sleepless nights, fueled by a passion they were now trying to erase. Her gaze drifted from Liam's triumphant smile to Marcus Thorne, her department director, the man who had looked her in the eye just 2 weeks prior and promised her the world. "This project will be your ticket to team lead, Alara," he had said, his voice like warm honey. "Just keep it under wraps." Now, Marcus was looking at Liam with that same paternal pride, a look that slid right past Alara, as if she were nothing more than a coat rack. In that single, dismissive glance, the betrayal was complete. It was a two-pronged dagger, one blade held by the friend she trusted, the other by the mentor she admired. The pain was sharp, immense, but beneath it, something else was stirring. A cold, quiet clarity. The world she believed in, a world of merit and hard work, had just crumbled into dust. But as she watched the thieves celebrate their victory, Alara Vance made a silent vow. They had stolen her work, but they could not steal her mind. They had taken her voice, so she would learn to speak in a language they couldn't ignore, the language of consequence. The demolition of her career was not an ending. It was a groundbreaking ceremony. To understand the depth of the wound, you must first understand the soul it pierced. Alara Vance was not built for the ambiguous battleground of the modern office. She was a creature of logic, of elegant systems and binary truths. Since childhood, she had found solace in the quiet, predictable world of numbers and code, a world where problems had solutions and every command yielded a direct and honest consequence. While other children were learning the complex and often contradictory rules of social engagement on the playground, Alara was teaching herself programming languages from library books, finding a more profound friendship in the structured syntax of C++ than in the fickle allegiances of her peers. She grew up in a modest suburban home, the only child of 2 loving parents who were perpetually in awe of their quiet, fiercely intelligent daughter. Her father was an accountant, her mother a librarian. They were good people who lived in a world of tangible certainties. They saw her talent as a gift, a ticket to a stable future, but they never truly grasped the sheer scale of her intellect. To them, her graduating summa cum laude in computer science and landing a job at a prestigious firm like Innovate Dynamics was the happy ending to the story. They couldn't comprehend that for Alara, it was just the beginning of a war she was not equipped to fight. Her entire life had been a testament to the principle of meritocracy. In academia, her work spoke for itself. Her code was cleaner, her algorithms faster, her solutions more innovative. She didn't need to be the loudest person in the room because her results created their own undeniable gravity. She arrived at Innovate Dynamics, bright-eyed and brimming with a quiet confidence, believing this new professional world would operate on the same fundamental principle. She was naive. She quickly learned that the corporate ecosystem ran on a different kind of code, an unwritten language of social maneuvering, strategic alliances, and carefully managed perception. It was a language she did not speak. In meetings, she would formulate a brilliant solution in her mind, but would wait for the perfect, logical moment to interject, a moment that never came. Instead, louder, more confident voices would throw out half-formed ideas that gained traction through sheer force of personality. Her older colleagues, mostly men in their late 30s and 40s, saw her not as a peer, but as a curiosity. At 22, she looked even younger, and her tendency to listen more than she spoke was misinterpreted as insecurity rather than calculation. The condescension was subtle, 1,000 tiny paper cuts a day. They called her kiddo. It was never said with overt malice, but with a casual, dismissive paternalism that constantly reminded her of her place. A senior engineer named Dave, a man with a coffee-stained shirt and a booming voice, once clapped her on the shoulder and said, "Kiddo, be a pal and grab me a latte from the break room, will you? My hands are full." He had mistaken her for a new intern. When she quietly corrected him, explaining that she was the engineer assigned to debug his flawed code from the last quarter, he simply blinked, grunted, and walked away, a flicker of embarrassment quickly replaced by indifference. She was erased. She was the ghost in the machine long before she ever built one. To survive, Ilara retreated further into her work. She told herself that the social game was just noise, a distraction from what truly mattered, the elegant, beautiful purity of the work itself. If they wouldn't listen to her voice, she would make them listen to her results. She would write code so brilliant, build systems so flawless that her value would become an objective, irrefutable fact. They could call her kiddo. They could ignore her in the hallways. They could forget to invite her to after-work drinks, but they could not ignore a system that increased efficiency by 200%. They could not ignore a solution that saved the company millions of dollars. This became her gospel, her singular focus. It was a dangerous faith, for it blinded her to the fact that in the human world, facts are malleable, and credit is a currency that is often stolen, not earned. This fervent belief in the power of pure merit is what made her so vulnerable. It's why, when Liam Carter offered her a smile and a seat at his lunch table, she saw a friend, not a predator. It's why, when Marcus Thorne praised her potential in private meetings, she saw a mentor, not a manipulator. They spoke to the part of her that desperately wanted to believe that her quiet dedication was finally being seen. They were the architects of her hope, a hope they would later use as the blueprint for her betrayal. She was the unseen prodigy, the silent engine in the background, utterly convinced that her work would one day force the world to see her. And in a tragic way, she was right. Her work would indeed change everything, just not in the way she had ever imagined. A predator, to be effective, must first master the art of camouflage. In the corporate jungle of innovate dynamics, the most dangerous creatures were not the ones who bared their teeth, but the ones who offered a comforting smile. Ilara Vance, brilliant as she was in the world of data, was tragically illiterate in the language of deceit, and she was surrounded by two of its most fluent speakers, Marcus Thorne and Liam Carter. Marcus was the silverback gorilla of the department, a man whose charisma was a tangible force field. He walked with a politician's gait, his suit was always impeccably tailored, and his smile never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. He was a master of the grand gesture and the motivational speech, able to fill a room with a sense of purpose and optimism that would evaporate the moment he left. He cultivated an image as a visionary, a champion of disruptive talent, but in reality, he was a hollow vessel, a manager who hadn't had an original idea in a decade. His true talent lay in identifying the ideas of others and positioning himself at the center of their success. He saw the fire in Ilara from the beginning, but he had no interest in warming his hands by it. He wanted to harness it, to point its brilliant light wherever it would best serve his own ascent up the corporate ladder. His approach to Ilara was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. About once a month, he would summon her to his glass-walled office, a fishbowl from which he could observe his entire domain. He would lean back in his expensive leather chair, gesturing for her to sit, creating an immediate and deliberate power imbalance. He never spoke to her about daily tasks. He spoke about destiny. "Ilara," he'd begin, his voice a low, confidential hum. "I don't look at you and see a junior engineer. I see an architect. The people out there," he would say, gesturing vaguely at the bustling office, "they build walls. You build cathedrals." He would listen intently as she shyly explained her latest project, nodding slowly, making her feel as though she were sharing state secrets with a king. He dangled the prospect of leadership not as a job, but as a calling. "A title is just a title, Ilara. What you have is influence, vision. My job is to make sure the company gives you the platform you deserve. We just have to be patient, strategic. The old guard can be resistant to true change." With these conversations, he accomplished two things. He inflated her sense of importance while simultaneously demanding her secrecy and patience, effectively isolating her and her work under his exclusive control. He was not her mentor, he was her gatekeeper. If Marcus was the cold, distant sun promising a future spring, Liam Carter was the warm, nourishing earth beneath her feet. Liam was the reason Ilara didn't quit in her first 6 months. He was a few years older, with a disarming, boyish charm and a perpetual air of being slightly overwhelmed, which made him seem relatable and non-threatening. While others ignored her, Liam saw her. He found her eating lunch alone in the cafeteria during her first week and simply sat down, offering a wry comment about the questionable quality of the chili. He asked her name. He asked what she was working on, and he actually listened to the answer. He became her translator for the unspoken rules of the office, her guide through the maze of office politics, and most importantly, her friend. Their daily lunches became the one part of her day she looked forward to without reservation. It was a safe harbor where she could finally lower her defenses. She would talk animatedly about recursive functions and neural networks, her eyes lighting up with a passion she showed nowhere else. Liam would listen, leaning in, asking intelligent questions that made her feel seen and respected. He, in turn, would share his own frustrations, his own ambitions. "I just want to build something that matters, you know," he'd confide, looking at her with a manufactured sincerity. "But I get stuck. I can see the big picture, but I get lost in the details. You can do both. You're a genius, Ilara, a real one. These dinosaurs out there are too blind to see it, but I do. Don't you ever forget that." He was her cheerleader, her confidant, her brother in arms. He was the one she complained to after Marcus gave another vague, inspiring speech that resulted in no actual change. He was the one she celebrated with, over coffee, when she finally cracked a difficult problem. She gave him her trust, completely and without question, because she couldn't imagine that such warmth could hide such a cold and barren ambition. She saw him as her only ally, the one person who had her back. In reality, he was standing behind her, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to slide a knife into it. Marcus and Liam were two sides of the same predatory coin. Marcus offered the grand, intoxicating promise of the future, while Liam provided the daily, comforting validation she needed to survive the present. One controlled her ambition, the other her heart. Together, they built a perfect cage of trust and hope around her, a cage she didn't even realize she was in until the day they decided to steal the songbird. Every great creation begins not with a bang, but with a quiet observation. For Ilara Vance, it began with a flicker on a screen, a statistical ghost that no one else could see. Innovate Dynamics, like so many companies of its size, was data-rich but knowledge-poor. It collected mountains of information, customer behavior, market trends, logistical feedback, but its tools for analysis were archaic, like trying to navigate a superhighway with a horse and cart. The existing systems were slow, inefficient, and worst of all, they could only look backward. They were excellent at producing reports about what had happened last quarter, but utterly blind to the subtle currents that would shape the next. One Tuesday afternoon, while running a tedious diagnostic, Ilara noticed it. A faint, almost imperceptible correlation between social media sentiment in one specific demographic and a drop in sales 2 weeks later. It was a pattern so subtle that the company's software, with its blunt, brute force approach, had missed it entirely. For everyone else, it was meaningless noise. For Ilara, it was a revelation. In that moment, she saw the company's true vulnerability. It wasn't the competition or the market. It was their own institutional blindness. And she knew, with the kind of intuitive certainty that defined her genius, that she could build them a better I. That observation became an obsession. Her small, Spartan apartment transformed into a crucible of innovation. Her life shrank to the dimensions of her 2 monitors, her world governed by the relentless cycle of coding, compiling, and debugging. Sleep became a necessary inconvenience, meals a forgotten chore. The whiteboards in her living room, once bare, were now covered in a chaotic tapestry of complex algorithms and data flow diagrams. This was not a job, it was a calling. She was an artist consumed by her masterpiece, a composer hearing a grand symphony in her head and working frantically to get all the notes down. She was building something that had never existed before, a unified intelligence. She decided to call it Chimera. In mythology, the Chimera was a single creature forged from the parts of many. Her creation was the same. It was a monstrous, beautiful hybrid of 3 distinct analytical engines, woven together with millions of lines of her own elegant code. The first part was the Lion, a powerful deep learning model that could sift through years of historical data, identifying the deep, foundational patterns of the business. The second was the Serpent, a nimble, real-time sentiment analysis tool that could coil through the chaotic streams of social media and news feeds, understanding the present mood of the market with uncanny precision. The final part, the Eagle, was her masterwork, a predictive engine, a form of artificial intuition that could take the learnings from the Lion and the Serpent, soar above the noise, and see the future with terrifying accuracy. A breakthrough of this magnitude is a difficult thing to keep to oneself. The joy of creation is often twinned with an irrepressible urge to share it. And in Ilara's isolated world, there was only one person she wanted to share it with: Liam Carter. One evening, when the office was quiet and the sky outside was turning a deep indigo, she beckoned him over to her desk, her voice a hushed, trembling whisper of excitement. "Liam, you have to see this." For the next hour, she walked him through Chimera. She showed him the architecture, the interlocking modules, the raw, elegant power of the source code. She demonstrated its capabilities, feeding it a live data stream and watching as it predicted a minor supply chain disruption 3 days before it was scheduled to happen. Liam's performance was flawless. His eyes widened, his jaw hung slightly agape. He peppered her with questions that feigned awe, but were, in reality, a form of meticulous intelligence gathering. "My God, Ilara, how did you get the predictive model to learn that fast? Is the sentiment analysis API custom built? Can I look at the source for the core engine?" He framed his intrusion as a desperate need to comprehend her genius. Finally, he leaned back, shaking his head as if in disbelief. "This island, this is a game changer. This isn't just a project, it's the future of the company. It's too important for you to carry alone." Then came the poisoned offer, wrapped in the sweet language of friendship. "Let me help," he said, his voice earnest. "I can help with the documentation, build the presentation deck. I can be your second pair of eyes, protect you from the corporate vultures. We can do this together." Ilara, starved for validation and blinded by her trust, saw only a friend offering his hand. She gave him full administrative access to her private code repository. She had just handed the zookeeper the keys to the cage. Feeling emboldened, she decided to show a sliver of her work to Marcus. She prepared a high-level, 10-minute overview, carefully avoiding the technical depth. Marcus listened with a practiced air of detached interest, checking his watch, nodding at all the wrong times. He gave her a patronizing pat on the back. "Good initiative, Vance. Keep up the creative thinking," he said, before dismissing her. The disappointment was a physical blow, but it was a calculated performance. That evening, just as she was packing up, his assistant appeared. Mr. Thorne wanted to see her. The moment the door to his office was closed, his entire demeanor changed. The mask of indifference was gone, replaced by a hawk-like intensity. "Don't ever show me something like that in a public setting again," he said, his voice low and sharp. "An idea like this, it's not a project, it's a weapon. And you don't show your weapons to the enemy until you're ready to fire." He told her he had to appear dismissive to protect the idea from his rivals, from the bureaucratic rot that would stifle true innovation. He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "This is our silver bullet, Alara, yours and mine. I want you to finish it in secret. Tell no one. When it's done, I'm not just giving you a promotion. I'm building a new division. Your division. Now go and finish building my legacy and yours." Ilara walked out of his office that night feeling 10 feet tall. Her passion was validated. Her friend was by her side. Her mentor was clearing her path to glory. She had everything she needed to succeed. She was a lamb, being lovingly guided to the slaughter, and she couldn't have been happier. The weeks leading up to the betrayal were, for Ilara, the happiest and most productive of her professional life. She was no longer just an engineer. She was an architect, a creator on the verge of a masterpiece. She and Liam were, in her mind, a perfect team. She was the brilliant, introverted mind behind the curtain, and he was the charismatic champion who would present their creation to the world. She would work late into the night, refining the last of Chimera's code, and he would often stay with her, bringing her coffee, ostensibly to help with documentation and strategy. She mistook his presence for partnership, his probing questions for intellectual curiosity. She was so consumed by the joy of her work, she never noticed that his notebook was filled not with ideas, but with her answers. She never noticed that his contributions were not additions, but meticulous extractions of her knowledge. While she was building, he was plundering. Late at night, long after she had gone home, exhausted but fulfilled, Liam would sit at his own terminal, a shadow among the sleeping monitors. With the administrative access she had freely given him, he executed his plan with the cold precision of a safecracker. It was a digital heist. He cloned her entire code repository, creating a perfect duplicate. But he was clever. He knew a simple copy could be traced. So he began the painstaking process of disguising his theft. He ran scripts to change the names of her elegantly named variables to clunky, corporate-sounding ones. He rewrote the comments in her code, replacing her concise technical notes with his own verbose, buzzword-laden explanations. He took the beautiful, complex heart of her machine and wrapped it in a bland, gray business suit. He then poured all of his energy into creating the one thing he was actually good at, a slick, visually impressive presentation deck. He translated her genius into digestible, bullet-pointed lies, crafting a narrative that placed him, and him alone, at the center of a heroic story of innovation. It was a premeditated act of intellectual violence, performed silently in the dead of night. The summons came on a Wednesday morning. A calendar invitation appeared in everyone's inbox, its title intentionally vague: Project Keystone, a strategic briefing. It was mandatory for all senior staff and the entire engineering department. Ilara's heart leaped. This is it, she thought. Marcus was finally ready. The secrecy, the quiet work, it was all about to pay off. She felt a nervous, bubbling excitement. She imagined Marcus calling her to the front, the surprise on her colleagues' faces, the quiet, earned respect she had worked so hard for. She even sent Liam a quick message, "Good luck today." He didn't reply. The boardroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Ilara found a seat near the back, a small, anonymous figure in a room full of outsized egos. She saw Liam at the podium, shuffling his notes, looking pale and nervous. She gave him a reassuring smile, which he met with a fleeting, unreadable glance before looking away. Then Marcus Thorne strode to the front of the room, his smile as wide and polished as the mahogany table. "Good morning," he boomed. "We are here today because we stand at a turning point, a moment that will define the future of Innovate Dynamics. For months, one of our own has been working tirelessly on a vision that will not just change the game, but reinvent it entirely. I want to introduce you to the man behind that vision, Liam Carter." Time seemed to slow down. The name echoed in Ilara's ears, a discordant, impossible note. She watched, as if in a dream, as Liam walked to the podium and cleared his throat. The first slide appeared on the massive screen behind him. Project Chimera, it read. A cold dread, sharp and absolute, began to creep up her spine. And then he began to speak. He spoke of a tripartite analytical engine. He spoke of a lion, a serpent, and an eagle. He used the exact phrases, the same quirky analogies she had invented and shared with him in what she thought were moments of collaborative joy. He was stealing her work, and he was using her own words to do it. The presentation was a masterpiece of deception. He glossed over the technical details with a confident wave of his hand, focusing instead on the business applications, the profits, the glory. When one of the executives asked a particularly difficult question about the algorithm's learning rate, Alara saw a flicker of raw panic in Liam's eyes. He was a fraud, and he was about to be exposed. But then he took a breath and regurgitated, almost verbatim, the detailed explanation she had given him just last week when he had asked the very same question. Throughout the entire sordid performance, Alara's eyes were fixed on Marcus. She pleaded with him silently, her gaze a desperate, frantic prayer. "Stop this. Tell them the truth. This is a mistake." But Marcus wasn't watching her. He was beaming at Liam, nodding in encouragement, a proud father watching his son hit a home run. He was not an unwitting spectator. He was the director of this grotesque play. After a round of thunderous applause for Liam, Marcus stood once more, his arms raised for silence. "Liam's vision is too important to be just another project," he announced, his voice filled with theatrical gravitas. "That is why, effective immediately, we are forming a new department, the Strategic Innovation Division. And I can think of no one better to serve as its first director than the man who built this future with his own two hands, Liam Carter." The room erupted. Executives and colleagues rushed to the front to shake Liam's hand, to clap him on the back. It was a coronation. And in that roaring wave of applause, Alara Vance was completely and utterly alone. No one looked her way. No one saw the silent scream on her face. In the space of 30 minutes, they had stolen her masterpiece, murdered her career, and buried her under the tombstone of their ambition. The grand theft was complete. The immediate aftermath of the presentation was a sensory vacuum. The roar of applause faded into a dull, distant hum, like the sound of blood in Alara's ears. She sat frozen in her chair, an island of stillness in a sea of celebration, watching as Liam, her friend, and Marcus, her mentor, accepted congratulations for a victory they had stolen from her. The world had tilted on its axis, and she was struggling to find her footing on this new, treacherous ground where truth was irrelevant and reality was simply a matter of consensus. For a long, paralyzing moment, she did nothing. Then, a spark of pure, unadulterated rage cut through the fog of shock. This would not stand. She found Liam near his new office, the one that should have been hers. He was surrounded by a small group of fawning colleagues, but she waited, her body rigid with a tension that was almost painful. When the crowd dispersed, she stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Liam," she said, her voice a low, trembling wire of sound. "We need to talk." He looked at her, his face a carefully constructed mask of surprise and concern. "Alara, hey, what a day, huh? Can you believe it?" He started to walk past her, but she held her ground. "That was my work, Liam. You know it was. Every line of code, every concept." Liam's friendly demeanor curdled into something else, a sort of pitying condescension. He let out a small, disbelieving laugh. "Whoa, Alara, where is this coming from? Are you feeling okay?" He was gaslighting her, and he was doing it with the effortless skill of a seasoned liar. "Look," he continued, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "I get it. We worked closely. We threw ideas around. There was a lot of synergy. It's easy to get lines blurred. But you have to remember, you were focused on the core programming, the technical stuff. I was the one who built the strategic architecture, the business case. I took a piece of raw code and made it a product." He was trying to reframe her as a simple cog in his grand machine. The audacity of it stole her breath. As she stood there, speechless, he delivered the final, crushing blow. "Honestly, Alara, I'm a little hurt that you'd think this. I thought we were friends. I thought you'd be happy for me." He had not only stolen her work, he was now recasting himself as the victim of her supposed jealousy. He made her feel insane. Reeling from his denial, she went straight to the source of the conspiracy. She didn't knock on Marcus Thorne's door. She walked straight in. He was on the phone, but held up a finger, finishing his call with a smooth, unhurried charm before turning his full, cold attention to her. He did not invite her to sit. "Marcus," she began, her voice shaking but resolute. "Chimera was my project. You and I spoke about it for months. You promised me that leadership position." Marcus listened, his expression unreadable, his hands steepled before him. When she was finished, there was a long, chilling silence. "Ilara," he said finally, his voice devoid of any of the warmth he had shown her in their secret meetings. "You wrote a very promising, very clever piece of experimental code. For that, you should be proud. What Liam presented today was a fully realized, enterprise-level business solution with a clear path to monetization. They are not the same thing. It was a staggering lie, delivered with the casual authority of a man who created truth simply by speaking it. You made a valuable contribution to the team's success," he continued, "and the team succeeded. That is all that matters." Then came the steel beneath the velvet. "I'm going to give you some free advice, because I still believe you have potential. In this business, there are two kinds of people: team players and solo artists. Right now, you are at a crossroads. You can choose to be seen as the bitter, unprofessional engineer who couldn't handle her teammates' success, or you can be the mature professional who celebrates a win and asks what she can do next. The first path is a career dead end. The second still has possibilities. The choice is yours." It was a threat, elegantly packaged as mentorship. He was telling her to swallow the lie, or he would personally destroy her career. The poison spread quickly. Within a day, the entire office climate had changed. The narrative, expertly crafted by Liam and Marcus, had taken root. Ilara Vance was unstable, jealous, trying to steal credit for Liam's heroic achievement. Her colleagues began to treat her like a pariah. Conversations would halt when she approached the coffee machine. The friendly nods in the hallway were replaced with averted eyes. She was a ghost, haunting the place where her dreams had just been murdered. Her work assignments became a form of psychological torture. Liam, now her direct superior, took a cruel and specific pleasure in her humiliation. He removed her from all work related to Chimera, reassigning her to the digital equivalent of a salt mine. She was tasked with running diagnostics on legacy systems that were years from being decommissioned. She spent her days writing mind-numbing documentation for obsolete software, a brilliant architect forced to patch cracks in a condemned building. Each menial task was a deliberate message: this is what you are worth now. You are nothing. The worst part was the insidious creep of self-doubt. The gaslighting had been so absolute, so universally supported, that she began to question her own memory, her own sanity. Lying awake at night, she would replay every conversation, scrutinize every email. Did I misunderstand him? Did I exaggerate my own role? Are they right? Am I crazy? They weren't just stealing her work, they were systematically erasing her, not just from the company's history, but from her own sense of self. It was a slow, suffocating, and deliberate burial. And for a time, she almost let them shovel the dirt over her face. The weeks that followed were a study in systematic degradation. Ilara's existence at Innovate Dynamics was reduced to a series of quiet humiliations, each one meticulously designed to break her spirit. The isolation was absolute, a silent, suffocating quarantine. Yet, the human spirit can endure almost anything, until it is dealt one final, gratuitous insult. For Ilara, that moment came on a Thursday afternoon. Liam, reveling in his new role as director, had called a major strategy session for the Chimera 2.0 initiative. Ilara, naturally, was not invited. She sat at her desk, just outside the glass walls of the main conference room, a ghost watching a seance for her own murdered creation. She could see Liam at the head of the table, struggling. He was trying to explain the predictive engine's core learning module, the Eagle, her proudest achievement, but he lacked her fundamental understanding. He was using the wrong terms, his hands gesturing vaguely, his confidence visibly crumbling as the senior engineers asked probing questions he couldn't answer. He was a king in stolen robes, and the clothes didn't fit. Suddenly, his eyes darted up and met Ilara's through the glass. He saw her watching him, her expression placid, unreadable. He saw her witnessing his fraudulence. A flash of pure, venomous spite crossed his face. He abruptly stopped the meeting, strode out of the conference room, and walked directly to her desk. In his hand was a thick, dusty binder. He dropped it onto her keyboard with a loud thud that made everyone in the vicinity look up. "Vance," he said, his voice loud enough for the entire department to hear, "I need you to stop what you're doing and archive all the documentation for the old quarterly reporting system. It's a priority." It was a task for an intern, a piece of digital housekeeping so menial it was insulting. But the task itself wasn't the point. It was a public dominance play, a brutal and deliberate message to her and to everyone else. "I am in charge. You are nothing. Look at how far you have fallen." In that moment, something inside Ilara snapped. It wasn't a loud, fiery break, but a quiet, cold, and final fracture. The lingering pain, the corrosive self-doubt, all of it was instantly cauterized by the white-hot flame of pure, unadulterated clarity. They would not break her. They would not erase her. They had mistaken her silence for surrender, but she was merely gathering her strength. That night, she didn't seethe or cry. She sat in her quiet apartment and, for the first time in weeks, she felt calm. The game was over. Not because she had lost, but because she was finally refusing to play by their rules any longer. Staying at Innovate Dynamics would be a slow suicide of the soul. Fighting them from within was impossible. They owned the board, the pieces, and the rulebook. The only logical, strategic move was to walk away from their board and build her own. The vague, hot desire for revenge cooled and solidified into a cold, hard purpose. This was no longer a matter of emotion. It was an engineering problem, and she was the best engineer she knew. The goal was no longer to reclaim credit. It was to achieve justice on an epic scale. The next morning, Ilara walked into the office with a newfound serenity that was deeply unsettling to those around her. She typed a 2-sentence resignation letter, printed it, and signed it. It was a masterpiece of professional detachment. She walked to HR, handed it in, and then requested a brief exit interview with Marcus. In his office, Marcus leaned back with a look of smug satisfaction. He had won. The problem had solved itself. "I think this is for the best, Ilara," he said, the false sincerity dripping from his voice. "Sometimes a role just isn't the right fit. I wish you the very best in your future endeavors." He saw a defeated little girl, a minor annoyance now neatly swept aside. He had absolutely no idea he was shaking hands with the woman who would one day own his ruin. Her final 2 weeks were a quiet performance of compliance. She did her menial tasks with a detached efficiency. Then came her last day. She waited until the office was empty, until the only sounds were the hum of the servers and the distant traffic on the street below. The cleaning crew had come and gone. She was alone. She sat down at her terminal one last time. Her system access, through some administrative oversight, was still active. With calm, deliberate keystrokes, she navigated through the company's servers, her fingers flying across the keyboard with an old, familiar intimacy. She opened the source code for Chimera. For a moment, she simply looked at it, her creation, now tainted by another's name. It felt like visiting the grave of a loved one. But she was not there to mourn. She was there to leave a message. She scrolled deep into the core of the predictive engine, to a section of code that handled benign data compilation, a place no one would ever think to look. She wasn't planting a virus or a bug. Sabotage was clumsy, emotional, and illegal. Her move was one of pure, poetic justice. She created a new comment block, disguising it as a legacy system authorization key. Inside, she wrote a single, cryptic line, Refas General Sys, the 19th of August, 2022, EV Jost, Protocol, active. It was meaningless to anyone else. But to her, it was everything. The numbers were her birthday. The initials were hers. And the phrase "ghost protocol" was a promise. She was the ghost in their machine. Harmless, invisible, but permanent. It was her name, carved into the digital stone of the cathedral she had built, a secret signature that irrefutably proved her authorship. She hit compile. The change was seamlessly absorbed. The ghost was now set. She logged out, gathered the small box of her personal effects, and walked out of Innovate Dynamics without a backward glance. As the glass doors slid shut behind her, she did not feel the sting of defeat. She felt the thrill of a new beginning. They thought they had erased her. They thought she was broken. They were wrong. This was not an exit. It was an escape. This was not a retreat. It was a strategic repositioning. The silent departure was over. The silent war had just begun. The first week of freedom was a week of sleep. The adrenaline that had fueled Ellora's cold, calculated departure drained away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. The rage that had been a pillar of fire in her mind dwindled to embers, and for a few days she was adrift in a gray, silent limbo. She had escaped the prison, but she hadn't yet figured out what to do with the rest of her life. She lived off her meager savings, watching as the world she had once worked so hard to be a part of continued on without her, a distant, glittering machine she no longer had access to. The temptation to despair was a heavy blanket, threatening to smother the last of her fire. But Ellara Vance was not built to surrender. The embers of her anger, fanned by the harsh winds of dwindling finances and a future that was a blank page, began to glow once more. The quiet need to build, to solve, to create, the very essence of who she was, began to stir. One morning, she walked to the whiteboard that still stood in her living room, a ghost of her last creation. She erased the last faded diagrams of Chimera, a final, cleansing ritual. Then, she uncapped a fresh marker and began to draw. She was not rebuilding what was stolen. She was building its successor, its avenger. Chimera had been brilliant, but it was a creature designed to live in a corporate zoo, constrained by old systems and bureaucratic thinking. This new creation would be born in the wild. It would be leaner, faster, more aggressive, and infinitely more intelligent. She would call it Phoenix. It was a system designed not just to analyze data, but to weaponize it. She poured every ounce of her pain, her knowledge, and her ferocious intellect into the code. Her monastic life intensified. She sold her car. She learned to live on coffee and instant noodles. Phoenix became her entire world, a fortress of logic and purpose she built around her wounded heart. After 3 months of relentless work, she had a working prototype, a piece of software so advanced it made Chimera look like a child's toy. But a weapon is useless without the power to wield it. She needed funding. Swallowing her pride, she made a call to a former university professor, Dr. Alistair Finch, one of the few people who had always recognized the true scope of her talent. After hearing a heavily redacted version of her story, the old professor was quietly furious. "The corporate world is a meat grinder for true talent, Ellara," he sighed, "but sometimes you find a lion who has survived it." He made one phone call. A week later, Ellara found herself in the oak-paneled library of a private downtown club, waiting for a man who was more of a legend than a venture capitalist, Arthur Chen. Arthur was in his late 60s, with a perfectly tailored suit and eyes that seemed to have weighed the worth of 1,000 ambitious dreamers and found most of them wanting. He was known for his brutal honesty, his impatience for buzzwords, and his uncanny ability to invest not in business plans, but in people. Ellara, nervous but resolute, dispensed with the pleasantries. She didn't have a glossy pitch deck or a 5-year projection. She simply opened her laptop. "Mr. Chen," she said, her voice steady. "This is Phoenix." For 20 minutes, she gave him a raw demonstration of its power. She showed him how it could predict stock market fluctuations based on the linguistic sentiment of financial news, how it could map and anticipate supply chain disruptions with frightening accuracy. She didn't sell, she simply showed. Arthur watched, motionless, asking only a few sharp, incisive questions. When she was finished, he was silent for a long time. "The technology is impressive," he said finally, his voice a calm baritone. "But I've seen a lot of impressive technology fail. I've seen brilliant engineers get crushed by the market. Tell me, Miss Vance, why will you succeed where so many others have not? Ilara met his intense gaze without flinching. The answer came from the very core of her being, a truth forged in the crucible of her betrayal. Because the people I will be competing against believe that a great idea is a commodity, something you can steal and own. I know that a great idea is a living thing, something you have to nurture and understand. They are motivated by greed. I am motivated by something else. And unlike them, I have already lost everything once. I am not afraid to lose it all again. A slow smile spread across Arthur Chen's face. He saw it then, the unbreakable will, the cold, clear fire of purpose. He saw a fellow survivor. The first check will be in your account by Monday, he said. Welcome to the game, Miss Vance. Phoenix Analytics was born. With Arthur's capital and his razor-sharp mentorship, Ilara moved with blinding speed. She rented a small, unglamorous loft in a forgotten industrial district, a space that valued bandwidth over appearances. She had no interest in building a typical company. She wanted to build a crew, a fellowship of the underestimated. Her first hire was a data visualization artist, a woman in her 50s who had been pushed out of her last job for being not a culture fit, which was corporate code for being too old and too brilliant for her insecure young boss. Her second was a systems architect who had been laid off after his company was acquired, a man who knew more about building stable, scalable systems than anyone Ilara had ever met. She assembled a small, fiercely loyal team of misfits and outcasts, all of them brilliant, all of them bearing the scars of the corporate world, and all of them hungry to prove their former employers wrong. The next 6 months were a blur of grueling, joyous work. They were fueled by cheap pizza, sleepless nights, and a shared, unspoken mission. The loft was a hive of activity, a place where the only currency was talent and the only hierarchy was the quality of one's ideas. It was everything Innovate Dynamics was not. Then came the breakthrough. A mid-sized logistics firm, a company that was being aggressively courted by Innovate Dynamics, agreed to a bake-off, a head-to-head competition between Chimera and Phoenix. It was the moment Ilara had been working towards. In the client's boardroom, she stood before their executives, no longer the invisible girl in the corner, but a confident CEO. She didn't use a presentation. She used Phoenix to do a live analysis of their own operational data. Within minutes, Phoenix had identified 3 major, previously unseen inefficiencies that were costing them millions a year. It was a stunning demonstration. The next day, they won the contract. That night, Ilara and her small team didn't celebrate with champagne. They celebrated with cheap beer and pizza boxes spread across a server rack, the signed contract lying in the center of the table like a holy relic. The victory was sweet, but for Ilara, it was more than just a business deal. It was the first shot fired in her silent war. The Phoenix had taken flight, and it was beginning its hunt. A stolen crown is a heavy and precarious thing to wear. At Innovate Dynamics, Liam Carter was discovering that it was one thing to claim ownership of a kingdom, and quite another to rule it. For the first few months after Ilara's departure, the Strategic Innovation Division ran on the residual momentum of her genius. Chimera performed its magic, the clients were happy, and Liam basked in the glory of a victory he had not earned. He was the charismatic visionary, the celebrated hero who had saved the company. But a machine, no matter how brilliant, needs a master who understands its soul, and Chimera's soul was an enigma to the man who claimed to be its father. Liam had stolen a perfect engine, but he had no idea how to maintain it, let alone improve it. He was a conductor trying to lead a symphony with a stolen score, able to wave the baton but utterly deaf to the music. The first cracks appeared subtly. The market, like a living organism, was constantly evolving. New data streams, new consumer behaviors, new variables were introduced into the ecosystem every day. Chimera, in Ilara's hands, would have learned and adapted seamlessly. Under Liam's clumsy stewardship, it began to drift. Its predictive models, which required constant, delicate tuning, started to lose their edge. The predictions were no longer uncannily accurate, they were merely adequate, and then, alarmingly, they became unreliable. A major retail client, one of the company's flagship accounts, relied on Chimera to predict holiday shopping trends. Based on Chimera's confident forecast, they invested millions in a new line of electronic gadgets. But the prediction was wrong. A subtle shift in market sentiment, a variable Alara would have caught in an instant, had been completely missed. The gadget sat on shelves, and the client was left with a warehouse full of expensive inventory and a furious CEO on the phone to Marcus Thorne. The failure sent a shockwave of panic through the division. Liam convened a war room, but it quickly became clear that he was out of his depth. He stood before his team of engineers, a group of competent but uninspired coders, and spouted the corporate jargon he had learned from Marcus. He talked about synergizing our core competencies and leveraging a paradigm shift, while the engineers stared back at him, desperate for technical guidance he was incapable of providing. They dove into Alara's code, a labyrinth of brilliant but complex architecture. They were like amateur mechanics trying to fix a Formula One engine. Every bug they patched seemed to create two new ones. The system grew unstable, glitchy. Chimera was becoming a ghost of its former self, a perfect machine slowly being dismantled by incompetent hands. The alliance between Marcus and Liam, forged in the heat of their shared ambition, began to buckle under the cold pressure of failure. The camaraderie was replaced by accusation and fear. "What is happening, Liam?" Marcus demanded, his voice dangerously low, during a tense meeting in his office. "You sold me a golden goose, and it's laying rotten eggs all over my biggest accounts." Liam, sweating under the expensive suit that now felt like a costume, became defensive. He blamed everything and everyone but himself. The data feeds were corrupt, the old company servers were too slow, his engineers were not proactive enough. In a moment of pure, desperate panic, the ultimate irony escaped his lips. "It's the original code," he stammered. "It's a mess. It's not scalable. It's like the person who built it didn't think about the long term." Marcus stared at him, his expression one of pure contempt. "I don't care about excuses," he hissed. "I stood in front of the board and tied my reputation to you and that black box of yours. You will fix it, or I will personally throw you into the bonfire that's burning down this department." The partnership was dead. All that remained were two co-conspirators, shackled together, sinking fast. The news of Chimera's decline spread through the industry like a virus. The logistics firm they had lost months ago was just the first domino. Now, the angry retail giant was threatening a lawsuit and quietly signing a contract with a new firm. Other clients, seeing the writing on the wall, began to demand audits and cancel renewals. The name Innovate Dynamics, once a symbol of cutting-edge technology, was becoming a punchline in industry circles. And as their star fell, a new one was beginning to rise. A small, mysterious startup was making waves. They called themselves Phoenix Analytics. They had no marketing department, no flashy headquarters, yet they were acquiring a roster of impressive clients with astonishing speed. Their reputation was built on word of mouth, on whispers of a new analytics engine that was faster, smarter, and more frighteningly accurate than anything the market had ever seen. One grim afternoon, Marcus and Liam sat together, staring at a list of the major accounts they had lost in the last quarter. Next to nearly every name was a small note from the sales team. "Lost to Phoenix Analytics." Cursing, Marcus typed the name into his web browser. The website that appeared was minimalist, professional, and confident. It showcased glowing testimonials from the very CEOs who had been screaming at him just weeks before. There was no corporate bloat, just a simple, powerful message. "We see the future, and we can prove it." As they scrolled, a deep, chilling sense of unease began to settle over them. The language used to describe the Phoenix platform, the concepts of predictive accuracy, the very philosophy of the technology. It all felt hauntingly, sickeningly familiar. At the bottom of the About Us page, there was no team photo, no lengthy corporate biography. There was only a single, stark line of text. Founder and Chief Architect, E. Vance. Liam's blood ran cold. "E. Vance?" he repeated, his voice barely a whisper. It could be anyone. Edward Vance, Eric Vance. But Marcus just stared at the screen, a dawning horror on his face. He remembered the quiet girl, the one they had dismissed, broken, and discarded. He remembered her silent departure, the look of calm resolve in her eyes that he had mistaken for defeat. The cracks in their empire were no longer just appearing. The entire foundation was beginning to crumble, and they had a horrifying suspicion that they were about to meet the architect of their destruction. The atmosphere at Innovate Dynamics had curdled from panic into a full-blown death spiral. The disastrous quarterly earnings report had landed like a bomb in the boardroom, and the fallout was radioactive. Their stock was in freefall, major institutional investors were dumping their shares, and the company was bleeding its most talented people who were fleeing the sinking ship in droves. At the epicenter of this implosion was Marcus Thorne. In a brutal meeting with the CEO and the board, he was stripped of his defenses, layer by painful layer. The numbers were undeniable. The charts all pointed aggressively downward, and every single red line originated from the catastrophic failure of his pet project, the Strategic Innovation Division. He was no longer the visionary. He was the architect of their ruin. The board gave him an ultimatum: present a viable plan to stop the bleeding in 1 week, or his long and storied career would come to an unceremonious end. That night, Marcus sat alone in his vast, silent office, the glittering city lights outside mocking his dark mood. He was a cornered animal, and the walls were closing in. His screen was open to the Phoenix Analytics website, its clean, confident design, a stark contrast to the chaos consuming his own company. For weeks, he and Liam had tried to dismiss the identity of Vance as a coincidence, but the evidence was becoming too overwhelming. The technology was too similar, too perfect a successor to Chimera. The whispers in the industry were growing louder. A part of him knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, who was behind it. But that would be admitting his own monumental, career-ending blunder. Instead, his survival instinct kicked in, twisting the terrifying truth into a desperate, brilliant, and utterly insane gambit. He would not be devoured by the Phoenix. He would capture it and claim its power as his own. He spent the next 48 hours crafting the most important pitch of his life. He stood before the board not as a failure, but as a ruthless strategist. "We are in a war," he began, his voice ringing with a newfound, desperate conviction, "and our primary weapon system, Chimera, has proven to be a liability. We can spend the next year and $50 million trying to fix it, with no guarantee of success. Or we can make a bold, decisive move. We can acquire the enemy. We can take our most dangerous competitor off the board, absorb their superior technology, and integrate their talent. Phoenix Analytics is the future. I am proposing that we buy it." He spun his failure as foresight, his desperation as daring. The board, exhausted, terrified, and seeing no other viable path out of the abyss, reluctantly gave him their approval. They were authorizing a man to purchase the very gun that was being pointed at his own head. Marcus's first contact with Phoenix Analytics was a masterwork of corporate arrogance. His email, addressed to a generic info alias, was less of an offer and more of a summons. It spoke of synergistic opportunities and hinted that a small startup like Phoenix should feel honored to be acquired by an industry pillar like Innovate Dynamics. He expected a quick, eager reply from a star-struck founder. The reply he received, 2 days later, was not from Vance. It was from a senior partner at one of the most notoriously aggressive law firms in the country, representing a holding company called AC Ventures. The tone was glacial. It stated that their client, Phoenix Analytics, was not for sale, but that out of professional courtesy, they would be willing to review a serious, fully funded, and unconditional offer. The power dynamic Marcus had tried to establish was instantly inverted. He was no longer the hunter, he was the supplicant. What followed was a brutal, weeks-long negotiation that was, in reality, a meticulously orchestrated psychological trap. On one side were Marcus and Liam, their desperation growing with each passing day as another negative story about Innovate Dynamics hit the trade press. They were hemorrhaging leverage, and they knew it. On the other side was Arthur Chen, a ghost pulling the strings through his lawyers, playing the role of the shrewd, reluctant investor. He and Alara had planned every move. They feigned disinterest to drive up the price. They made intrusive demands for Innovate Dynamics' internal financial data, turning the due diligence process back on the would-be acquirer. They bled Marcus for every possible concession, making him fight for a deal he believed was his own idea. "Something is wrong, Marcus," Liam said one night, his face pale with anxiety as they reviewed another set of demanding counteroffers. "They're toying with us. We know nothing about this Vance. She's a ghost. What if we're walking into an ambush?" Marcus, whose entire world was now balanced on the knife's edge of this single deal, exploded. "An ambush? Don't be a paranoid fool, Liam. It's a negotiation. The founder is a tech nerd who's letting her investor play hardball, that's all. This is our salvation. Our only salvation. I don't care if the CEO is a literal ghost, as long as we get that damned source code." His desperation had consumed his reason. He was so focused on the bait that he was completely oblivious to the steel jaws of the trap closing around him. Finally, after a month of psychological warfare, the email they had been waiting for arrived. "Our client has reviewed your final offer and has agreed to the terms in principle. A final, in-person meeting will be required to sign the non-binding letter of intent. The founder will be in attendance to answer any final questions." The meeting was set. Tuesday, 10 a.m. The location, the headquarters of Phoenix Analytics. Victory. Marcus and Liam felt a euphoric rush of relief. They had done it. They had weathered the storm and were about to seize the lifeboat. They spent the entire weekend preparing, polishing their talking points, selecting their most powerful suits. They saw themselves as corporate conquerors, striding into the offices of a lesser rival to claim their prize. They were perfecting their strategy for a battle that had already been lost, sharpening their swords for an execution where they were not the executioners. They were walking, willingly and confidently, into the heart of the web, utterly unaware of the patient, silent spider that was waiting for them. The trap was set. The elevator ride up to the offices of Phoenix Analytics was silent and tense. Marcus and Liam, dressed in their finest armor of bespoke suits and Italian leather shoes, felt an unfamiliar twinge of apprehension. They were titans of industry, representatives of an established power, yet the sleek, minimalist lobby and the quiet, the focused energy of the employees they passed felt less like a startup and more like a glimpse into a future they were no longer a part of. This was a place of creation, and it made their own company, with its toxic politics and crumbling morale, feel like a tomb. They were escorted by a silent assistant into the main boardroom. The room was a theater of power, dominated by a colossal black marble table that seemed to absorb the light. On one side, floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the city, their city, which now felt alien to them. Arthur Chen and a team of lawyers sat on the far side of the table, their faces impassive. But it was the head of the table that drew all the attention. A single high-backed executive chair, upholstered in black leather, was turned away from them, its occupant looking out at the skyline, a silent, commanding silhouette. Arthur Chen offered a curt nod. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming. We are prepared to finalize the terms of the agreement. But first, the founder and chief architect of Phoenix Analytics would like to begin." He gestured towards the chair. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, nothing happened. Then, with a slow, deliberate, and almost soundless motion, the chair began to swivel. First, they saw a hand, resting calmly on the armrest. Then, the profile of a face they thought they had forgotten. A face they had relegated to the footnotes of their own triumphant story. The chair completed its turn, and Alara Vance looked directly at them. The timid, overlooked girl was gone. In her place sat a woman exuding a power so cold and absolute it seemed to suck the very air from the room. Her expression was not one of anger or of triumph. It was one of complete, serene control. The reaction was a symphony of silent collapse. Liam Carter went physically white, his jaw slackening, a choked, gurgling sound catching in his throat. He looked as if he had just seen the ghost of someone he personally had murdered. Marcus Thorne's practiced, confident smile froze, then cracked, then melted away completely. replaced by a mask of slack-jawed, horrified disbelief. His mind, a finely tuned instrument of corporate maneuvering, sputtered and failed, unable to process the impossible reality before him. This was not a negotiation. This was a reckoning. Ilera let the silence hang in the air, a heavy, suffocating blanket. She let them drown in the full, terrifying scope of their miscalculation. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. With a small, discreet remote in her hand, she pressed a button. The massive screen on the wall behind her flickered to life, displaying the clean, elegant logo of Phoenix Analytics. Then, the presentation began. It was not a pitch. It was an execution. The screen filled with plunging bar graphs and jagged, downward, trending lines. This, Ilara's voice said, calm, clear, and amplified by the room's state-of-the-art sound system, is a real-time analysis of Innovate Dynamics' catastrophic loss of market share over the last 18 months, beginning on the date of my departure. She paused. As you can see, the primary inflection point of your company's collapse correlates directly with the public launch of Project Chimera. She moved to the next slide, a side-by-side comparison of Chimera and Phoenix. It showed dozens of failed predictions made by Chimera next to the flawlessly accurate predictions made by Phoenix on the same data sets. One of these systems is a finely tuned instrument capable of understanding the subtleties of a chaotic market, she explained, her voice as clinical as a surgeon's. The other is a stolen engine, rusting in a garage, being maintained by mechanics who have never learned how to drive. It is a hollow echo. Liam was visibly trembling, his face slick with sweat. Marcus was rigid, his face a mottled, unhealthy red. Ilara saved the final, most devastating blow for last. The screen now showed lines of code, the familiar, beautiful architecture of Chimera's core. Her code. A system, gentlemen, is more than just its function. It has a soul, an identity. The fatal flaw in your plan was the arrogant belief that you could own something you did not understand. Her fingers moved on the remote. She executed a diagnostic script. Deep within the code, a single line, a line that had lain dormant and invisible for nearly 2 years, began to flash, pulsing in a brilliant, damning red that filled the entire room with its light. It was her name, her proof, her ghost in their machine, now fully materialized for all to see. Ilara switched off the screen, plunging the room back into a tense twilight. She finally looked directly at the 2 broken men who had once held her career, her life, in their hands. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer amplified, but it was the loudest thing they had ever heard. "There will be no acquisition today," she said, each word a perfectly polished stone dropped into a deep, silent well. "There was never going to be an acquisition. I had no more interest in buying your decaying, corrupted company than an astronomer has in collecting dust. This," she said, gesturing around the magnificent room, "was never a negotiation. It was the final stage of my due diligence. My comprehensive, data-driven analysis of your utter and complete incompetence. Thank you for your cooperation." The verdict had been delivered. The power had not just shifted, it had been utterly and irrevocably transferred. The ghost had returned, not for a haunting, but for a hostile takeover of their reality. And she had just completed the purchase. The silence that followed Ilara's final pronouncement was more profound than any sound. It was the silence of utter annihilation. Marcus and Liam were no longer executives. They were hollowed-out effigies of the men they had been just 10 minutes prior. Their arrogance and ambition reduced to a pale, waxy residue of shock. The truth of their situation, in all its devastating clarity, had finally settled upon them. They were not here to buy a company. They were here to be dismantled. Liam was the first to break, a low, pathetic whimper escaping his lips. Marcus, however, tried to cling to one last shard of his former authority. "This is insane," he croaked, his voice raspy. "You can't. This is a farce. We have a letter of intent." It was then that Arthur Chen, who had been a silent, statuesque observer until this point, finally spoke. His voice, unlike Ilara's, was not cold. It was heavy, weighted with the gravitas of 2 decades of patiently waiting. He looked only at Marcus. "The letter of intent is quite real, Marcus. As is the acquisition. It just seems you misunderstood who was acquiring whom." Arthur rose slowly and walked to the head of the table, standing beside Alara. "You know, I once sat in a room much like this one, with a young, ambitious partner who had a brilliant idea for a data analytics company. A partner who, after I had done all the foundational work, diluted my shares to nothing and forced me out with a non-compete clause. That company was called Innovate Dynamics in its earliest form. And that partner was you." The last vestiges of color drained from Marcus Thorne's face. The ghost at the table was not Alara. It was him. "I spent 20 years building a new fortune," Arthur continued, his voice calm, always waiting for the right opportunity. "I learned that revenge is a dish best served, not cold, but with a flawless, data-driven execution. All I needed was the right engineer. And then one day, the most brilliant one I had ever seen walked into my life, carrying the scars of your very same brand of treachery. It seems your talent for betrayal, Marcus, has finally created a debt you can no longer afford." Alara then delivered the final terms, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. "Phoenix Analytics will be acquiring the assets of Innovate Dynamics," she stated, "for the salvage value of its intellectual property and client contracts, minus the liabilities incurred from the fraudulent mismanagement of Project Chimera. My offer is $1, and it is not negotiable." It was the ultimate humiliation. She was not even buying the company. She was taking possession of a shipwreck. The takeover was swift and merciless. 1 week later, Alara Vance stood before the assembled employees of Innovate Dynamics in the cavernous atrium of their own building. It was an all-hands meeting, and attendance was mandatory. Marcus and Liam were required to be there, standing in the front row, their faces ashen, their powerlessness a public spectacle. Alara, flanked by Arthur Chen and her own lean, hungry team from Phoenix, took the stage. "As of 9 a.m. this morning," she announced. Her voice clear and steady, "Phoenix Analytics has completed its acquisition of Innovate Dynamics. I know there is a great deal of uncertainty in this room. Let me be clear about the future, our future. We will be moving forward with a renewed focus on integrity, transparency, and true innovation." She paused, her eyes sweeping the crowd before landing, for a brief, cold moment, on Marcus and Liam. "As the first act of this new era, we are restructuring the leadership to eliminate redundancies and past inefficiencies. The positions of Chief of Department Operations and Director of the Strategic Innovation Division are hereby terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was a corporate execution, performed with the clean, quiet efficiency of a guillotine. She was true to her word. She did not destroy the company. She saved it from itself. She spent the next month conducting a meticulous autopsy, identifying the toxic managers and the political rot that had poisoned the culture. But she also found the brilliant, overlooked, and demoralized engineers, the quiet talents like her former self who had been suffocated under the weight of the old regime. She fired the sycophants and the bullies, and she promoted the creators and the problem solvers. She absorbed the best of them into the vibrant, meritocratic culture of Phoenix Analytics, giving them a home where their work, not their political skill, was what truly mattered. Weeks later, Alara stood alone in what was once Marcus Thorne's office. Her office. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. She now looked out upon, not as an invisible girl, but as a titan. She felt no rush of triumphant glee, no thrill of victory. The fire of her revenge had burned itself out, and what was left was not a void, but a profound and solid sense of peace. The revenge had been the fuel, she realized, but it had never been the destination. The true victory was not in their downfall, but in her own creation. She hadn't needed to tear them down to prove her worth. She had proven it by building something better, something honest, something that was truly hers. She had sought recognition and had found power instead. She had sought justice and had found purpose. It was a lesson learned in the crucible of betrayal, a truth that had become the bedrock of her new life. And as she watched the city lights begin to twinkle to life, a final thought crystallized in her mind, a mantra for the person she had become, and a warning to all the petty tyrants of the world. Never underestimate the silence of a person who has endured too much, because in that silence, they are not giving up, they are reloading. The wars of the workplace are endless, fought in the quiet cubicles and gilded boardrooms of every city on earth. Next week, we will journey into the heart of a prestigious law firm where a young associate discovers a secret that could not only disbar the partners, but bring the entire firm to its knees. Be sure to join us.